Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Co, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute? Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's at Drive Time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Good afternoon and welcome to GB News Sunday. Thank you very much indeed for joining me this lunchtime. I'm Emily Carver and for the next 2 hours I'll be keeping you company on your TV, online and digital radio. So coming up this hour, as the communications blackout eases in Gaza, Israel's bombardment continues, striking hundreds more Hamas targets. As the death toll rises, calls continue to ramp up for an immediate ceasefire. We'll be heading to Israel for the latest. And mass protests took place across the UK yesterday in solidarity with Palestine. But found among the crowds were protesters carrying effigies of dead babies, chants of globalise the Intifada, as well as the defacement of statues. Has the conflict sadly exposed deep divisions in this country? And the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, is facing criticism from senior figures in his own party over his stance on the conflict. That's as key members of the Labour Party defy his position. Please do get in touch throughout the show. Send me your thoughts on gbviews@gbnews.com. Send us a message on our socials. We're at GB News. But first, let's get the news headlines with Tatiana.
Emily, thank you and good afternoon. This is the latest from the GB Newsroom. Some communications have been restored in Gaza after a blackout severely impacted yesterday's rescue efforts. Israeli forces are expanding ground operations in Gaza, but the United Nations warns that civil order is starting to fade, with reports of people breaking into aid centres and warehouses in a desperate search for vital supplies. Despite assurances that aid trucks will be allowed in, the UN says supplies are insufficient. Last night, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said the second stage of war with Hamas has begun, and he warned of a long and difficult campaign ahead. The Gaza Health Ministry said this morning just over 8,000 people have been killed. It's unlikely that any Labour MPs will be sacked due to disagreements with the party's position on Israel. That's according to the Shadow Science Secretary. Peter Carl says the party's leadership will probably continue engaging with frontbenchers despite disagreements with Sir Keir Starmer. Sir Keir has echoed the UN's call for a humanitarian pause in fighting and for aid to be allowed into Gaza. But many senior figures want him to go further and back a ceasefire. In other news, the Hollywood actor Matthew Perry, star of the legendary sitcom Friends, has died at the age of 54.
Forget hypnosis. The way to quit smoking is you have to dance naked in a field of heather and then bathe in the sweat of 6 healthy young men.
Police were called to his home in Los Angeles, where he was found unresponsive in a hot tub. He became a household name as the dry and witty Chandler Bing, alongside Jennifer Aniston, Lisa Kudrow and others. The enormous success of Friends made it an icon of 90s popular culture. It ran for 10 seasons, and the final episode was the 5th most-watched finale in TV history. Warner Brothers said in a statement that his comedic genius was felt around the world and his legacy will live on in the hearts of many. Showbiz expert Kinsey Schofield spoke to GB News about the sad news.
This is a man who we have seen working on his body and challenging his body over the last few weeks. One of the last paparazzi photos taken of Matthew was on October 3rd as he exited a gym. So I know that there is speculation in regards to his past and, you know, could some of those demons have come back to haunt him when it comes to addiction? But he, over the last year or so, I'd say 2 years now, was very proud of his sobriety, promoted his sobriety, and was focused on being better physically and mentally.
Police are being encouraged to double their use of facial recognition software over the next 6 months to track down known offenders. Policing Minister Chris Philps says the technology could be used to scan more than 200,000 images, matching them against the police database. He's also encouraging officers to expand the use of live facial recognition so offenders might be identified on the spot. Mr Philps says it'll allow police to stay one step ahead of criminals and make Britain's streets safer. Meanwhile, the number of police who've been sacked for misconduct is up by 70%, with around 100 losing their jobs in the last 12 months. Metropolitan Police Commissioner Mark Rowley says the number is likely to increase as the force cracks down on those who are unfit to serve. A US tech entrepreneur says the NHS's backlog cannot be resolved without technological innovation. Alex Karps, the chief executive and co-founder of Plantier, which is bidding to win a contract to provide AI software to the health service. He says the use of AI in healthcare would speed up systems and improve life expectancy. That comes as NHS waiting lists are predicted to top 8 million by next summer. Scotland's Refugees Minister is asking the UK government for urgent funding to help communities house migrants. Emma Roddick supports the government's plan to cut the use of hotels for asylum seekers, and she says tackling a backlog in cases should be a priority. But she warns that shifting the financial burden onto local authorities would be unacceptable and reckless. Immigration Minister Robert Jenrick said this week that the number of hotels used to house migrants will be cut by 50 over the next 3 months. And finally, in sport, there was controversy last night when heavyweight champion Tyson Fury recovered from being knocked down, winning a split decision against newcomer Francis Ngannou. The 37-year-old MMA fighter Ngannou put Fury on the canvas in round 3 after connecting with a left hook. But while one judge scored it in favour of Ngannou, 2 of the judges gave it to Fury. His victory means a bout with fellow heavyweight champion Alexander Usyk remains on the line. This is GB News across the UK on TV, in your car on digital radio and on your smart speaker by saying play GB News. Now it's back to Emily.
Thank you, Tatiana, and welcome to GB News Sunday. So the Israeli military have said that their forces are expanding ground operations in Gaza, while their fighter jets have struck hundreds more Hamas targets. Telephone and internet communications have been partially restored in Gaza today after more than a day-long blackout that had badly impacted rescue operations as Israel continued its bombardment of targets of the Hamas group. However, thousands in Gaza have broken into aid depots in a worrying sign of civil disorder starting to break down. According to a UN relief agency, mass calls for a ceasefire grow, including from Pope Francis, who also appealed to Hamas for a release of hostages. Well, we can now cross over to Tel Aviv to get an update from our Home and Security editor, Mark White. Mark, the discussion over here is dominated by calls for a ceasefire. They seem to be ramping up, certainly in volume. Can you bring us the latest from where you are?
Well, there's absolutely no sign of a ceasefire, and there's no way that Israel at this stage would ever agree to that. It's determined to go after Hamas, to take out Hamas, to degrade it and ultimately destroy it. You know, for 3 weeks, people have been wondering when the ground war will begin. Well, it has begun. OK, it's not the ground war that a lot of people were expecting, with tens of thousands of troops and tanks going through that border fence and into Gaza. It is more in the way of larger scale or smaller scale, I should say, incursions into various areas around the northern Gaza Strip, but that is underway. And as we speak, there are Israeli forces in the northern Gaza Strip. They've pushed in a few miles into the northern Gaza Strip. The Israeli flag has been hoisted from a building in one of the communities there. The first time in many years that an Israeli flag has been seen in the Gaza Strip. And that will, of course, stoke its own resentment and emotions. And in fact, we've seen multiple rockets coming out of the Gaza Strip again today, headed for numerous communities, particularly around the Gaza Strip, but even where we are further north in Tel Aviv. A large rocket barrage a few hours ago with reports that some rocket fragments had smashed into the ground in a place called Rishon LeZion, which is on the southern outskirts of Gaza, of Tel Aviv, I should say.
Of Tel Aviv. Can I just ask you another question with regards to a ceasefire, because we've had very prominent politicians in this country and, of course, abroad, and masses of the public calling for a ceasefire. What would that look like? You say it's impossible considering Israel and its determination to crush Hamas. Would that essentially mean Israel putting down their weapons, and then what would Hamas do?
Well, that's what those calling for a broader ceasefire absolutely want. They want an end to Israel's operation and to the targeting of Hamas targets in Gaza. But that differs from what the UK, the US...
Oh, have we lost Mark there? Is Mark White still with us? Oh, Mark, sorry, I thought you were continuing to speak there. I thought we'd lost you. Yes, so we've heard sort of mixed reports as well, and I just want to get to the truth of this. We had Eylon Levi, who's the Israeli government spokesperson, speaking out very vocally about what is going on in terms of Israel's action in Gaza. Now, a question of whether Israel has cut off electricity to Gaza, he said that actually Hamas shot down the power lines. This was not Israel cutting off electricity. What is the truth behind all of these competing claims?
Well, I mean, who knows in the fog of war? I certainly don't know. But I know that Mark Regev, who is the spokesman for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, did say that it was standard practice in conflicts around the world that troops going in would often seek to cut off the communications or disrupt the communications of the enemy. That's not an admission that Israel was involved in doing that. He was asked, actually, are you saying that they've cut off? He said, I didn't say that. but he did say it was standard practice. So it's possible the Israelis did it. It's possible that perhaps Hamas were responsible for targeting accidentally one of their own communications nodes. It might be a mixture of both. What we know at this time is that communications are being restored to Gaza. And to be honest, I'm not sure how much difference it actually would have made on the ground to those Hamas fighters anyway if Israel had deliberately cut off communications, because what we're told is that there is a very sophisticated, actually not sophisticated, but a very tried and tested communication system within the tunnels that they're operating on, and that's hardwired closed circuit landlines that are running right through these hundreds of miles of tunnels, so they can speak to each other, and they're still coordinating every time they pop up and launch these attacks towards Israel. They're very clearly specifically coordinated, because you've got multiple sites launching those rockets towards places like Tel Aviv at exactly the same time. Now, they could be doing that at a set interval, but it's more likely that they're actually in direct communication with each other. And then the only way you deal with that ultimately is for Israel to get down and into those tunnels and to blow up those tunnels, to take on those Hamas fighters in effectively hand-to-hand combat. But then, of course, you've got the added issue of the now 230 hostages that they know about being held by Hamas.
And Mark, just very lastly, where are we in terms of humanitarian aid, and also reports that people are breaking into aid centres within Gaza in desperation, searching for vital supplies? Do you have any intel on that situation?
Well, there's no doubt the situation on the ground is dire. There have, as far as we know, been no aid trucks in today, and that was promised yesterday, with the Israeli Defence Forces saying that the aid operation would be stepped up across that Rafah crossing from Egypt into Gaza. There's only 80 trucks have come in recent days. There would normally be 400 trucks coming in on any given day. So aid supplies are running low. There's no doubt about that. I think what we saw overnight and into this morning with the storming of that warehouse and some other distribution centres in Gaza was in part brought about by this breakdown in communications, because the UN were not able to communicate directly with their aid workers on the ground to coordinate the relief effort. Then those supplies stopped for a while, and that, I think, added a bit to the panic in the community, which meant that thousands of people were smashing the gates down in this main warehouse.
Well, thank you very much for bringing us the very latest. Mark White, our security editor, live from Tel Aviv. I put quite a few questions to him just to get a grasp of what exactly is going on and what we do and don't know. As we know, there's huge amounts of conflicting information out there, so it's good to speak to our security editor there, Mark White. But in the studio, I have David Curtin with me, who will be joining me for the rest of this show. He is the leader of the Heritage Party, of course. Now, I started off with the demand for a ceasefire. We're seeing this across the West and, of course, the Arab world too. Mark seemed to suggest that that is an impossibility.
Well, I've called for a ceasefire as well. I think that's the humanitarian thing to do. But, you know, whether that's going to have any effect on the ground, I don't know. It's just something... I think, obviously, what happened on the 7th of October was horrific. It was a terrorist attack by Hamas. Nobody deserved to be killed, or anything that happened to the people there was not deserved in any way at all. But people are looking at what's happening now with Israel saying that they're targeting Hamas, but there is huge collateral damage, obviously, and depending on who you listen to, you don't know whether it's 4,000, 5,000, 7,000, 10,000 people have been killed, including thousands of children. And I think people are really very concerned about that.
I guess the counter to that is that not only did Hamas launch this deadly terror attack, this massacre on Israel, they have embedded their Hamas headquarters and their Hamas targets within the civilian population. So how are Israel supposed to eliminate Hamas, their enemy in this situation, without, unfortunately, and so sadly, civilian casualties.
Yeah, that's exactly right. They are using the people of Palestine, the people of Gaza as a human shield. But then if you go in and you try to get, target, I don't know how many Hamas fighters there are, a few thousand, how many are you going to kill? I mean, how many is acceptable? 10,000, 100,000, 2.2 million?
Yeah.
Where do you stop?
Yeah, and I think the question is the practicality of what a ceasefire would mean. So if Israel, in some alternative universe, said, OK, we'll put down our weapons, well then, David, what happens next? Hamas certainly aren't going to stop in their plans. They're continuing to bombard Israel. Will they put down their weapons, or will Hamas actually regroup and plan their next terror attack?
Well,
These are the questions.
The call for a ceasefire is to both sides.
Yeah.
It's for Israel to stop bombing Gaza because of the collateral damage, including to thousands of children. It's also a call on Hamas to stop sending rockets into Israel and to release the hostages as well. At some point, somebody is going to have to lose face in order to bring this to an end. Otherwise, the alternative is, someone kills 1,000 people, then the other side kills 5,000, the other side kills more, and then it just escalates and escalates. And where does it end?
Yeah. Do you think that Israel is at risk of losing the PR war in terms of the global reaction now to their bombardment of Gaza? Wrongly or rightly, there is a huge swelling of support for the Palestinian people. Some of that, unfortunately, may be support for Hamas and their intentions, but a vast swathe of people are looking at the horror that they see in Gaza, looking at lives being lost, and are coming down firmly on the side of the Palestinian people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in a war situation, this is a war situation. Both sides are going to put out PR and propaganda. This is part of the information war that is fought around the actual war. And, yeah, there's already a huge support for Palestine all over the world, especially in, obviously, the Muslim world. But in the West, there are many, many people, many Muslims here, and they will naturally support the Palestinian people because they see them as fellow Muslims. That's understandable. So, yeah, the PR war is being fought, and I think you look at the difference between the number of people in the pro-Palestine marches, the pro-Israel marches in London and other places. There are far, far more people coming out in the pro-Palestine marches. You can see that in counting the numbers of people who are there. So that's
yes, the numbers certainly are there. Well, we'll be coming on to the pro-Palestinian protests because, of course, they were once again in London and across the UK yesterday. But you're watching and listening to GB News Sunday with me, Emily Carver. We've got lots more coming up. Yes, we'll be discussing the pro-Palestine protests. Has the Israel-Hamas conflict exposed deep divisions in this country? As you can see there, a statue being defaced. We'll debate that next. You're watching and listening to GB News, Britain's news channel.
Who is it? We're here for the show.
More energy this time!
Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie.
Second best.
You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Oh! No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays at 9 on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's at Drive Time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christys, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Good afternoon, welcome to GB News Sunday with me, Emily Carver. I'm on your TV, online and digital radio. Now, we're going to be turning to what happened in London yesterday. There were, of course, mass protests once again. Thousands of pro-Palestinian protesters took to the street to protest Israel's bombardment of Gaza in the ongoing war with Hamas. Demonstrators clashed with the police. Several videos have circulated on social media showing protesters climbing on statues of former prime ministers. That's in Parliament Square, letting off flares, and others performing the call to prayer in front of the Cenotaph earlier this morning. I'm asking, has this conflict exposed deep divisions in Britain? Joining me now is Rafe Hadel-Mancu, a historian and one of our favourites here on GB News. Rafe, thank you very much for joining me. I put that question to you directly. Has the conflict that we're seeing in the Middle East and how it's playing out in this country, does it reflect or has it exposed deep divisions in our society?
It has undoubtedly. I mean, the fissures of tension that we've seen recently have been present for a long, long time. But it's actually incidents like this, or as we saw recently in Leicester with attacks between Muslims and Hindus. It takes those sorts of moments to actually make people, I think, sit up and realize just what a problem we have. You know, barely a week goes past when you don't have a mayor or a police commissioner saying that trite banality, that diversity is our greatest strength. Well, if anything of the last 2 weeks has shown, it's not our greatest strength. In fact, diversity is our greatest dilemma. And when you combine it with the policies of mass immigration and multiculturalism, it's actually one of our greatest weaknesses. And all of the sociological and economic research actually backs that up. You know, in 2019, there was a study done in Holland that looked at all 87 sociological and economic papers on diversity. And they all showed that increased diversity leads to a lack of trust, it erodes confidence, it erodes civic engagement, particularly on the community and the local level. It's something that we really need to address. Things are at a point now where we need to stop saying all of these trite, romantic statements like diversity is a strength and acknowledge the reality we can see all around us today.
Now, Rafe, you paint a pretty bleak picture, which I'm sure a lot of our viewers and listeners will agree with you on, sadly. But can there be a sense of optimism too? Do you have hope that our nation can heal its divides? Is there a hope for multicultural Britain that we can live harmoniously?
Well, there's multiculturalism and multiracialism are two different things. And that's one of the problems. You know, I gave a speech on this to the New Culture Forum just earlier this month about the issue of whether diversity is our greatest strength. But, you know, when I speak about this, when Suella Braverman speak about this, we often get people on the left saying, well, aren't you and Suella just poster children for how successful multiculturalism is? Well, no, because we're products of a multiracial society. And we were born into the very successful late 20th century multiracial Britain, which advanced a monoculture of Britain. People were free to celebrate their own cultures at home, but there was one predominant culture. what we've seen over the last 25 years is a promotion of minority cultures over the dominant British culture. And unfortunately, because of that, we've seen many problems arising with cultural practices that are actually completely abhorrent to our own way of life here in Britain. That needs to be addressed. And we need to have an honest, adult conversation about this rather than just trying to brush things under the carpet, because we can see where that gets us.
Now, Rafe, we've seen the defacement of statues during this protest, which, of course, is deeply unfortunate. But a lot of our viewers will be concerned looking forward to Remembrance Day, which is in 2 Saturdays' time. We've seen the cenotaph was the centre of one of the pro-Palestine protests. This is going to be difficult for the police if the protests continue to be organised on Saturdays.
Yes, no, you're quite right. Well, the police need to ensure that priority is actually given to Remembrance Sunday. And, you know, as I saw the protest yesterday down Whitehall, I couldn't help but think, you know, of the good number of Second World War veterans who are actually still alive. And they and their fallen comrades fought to defend freedoms, including the freedom to protest. And as you say, in 2 weeks, they're going to be marching down Whitehall past the statue of Field Marshal Haig that was vandalised. And, you know, they'll be forgiven for wondering, is this actually the Britain that we are, that they fought to defend so much? Because we're now routinely seeing this happening. We're routinely seeing our capital city being overtaken by vast numbers of people who actually loathe Britain and the West. And I'm not referring to all the protesters, because obviously many people are there genuinely out of concern for the plight of those in Gaza. And my heart also goes out unequivocally to all those who are suffering, who are Palestinian. But make no mistake, vast numbers of those people who were protesting yesterday are not motivated by concern for Palestine. They're primarily motivated out of hatred for Israel and the West, and also more broadly for Britain.
Well, thank you very much indeed for your insight. Rafe Heidelman-Koo, who is a very good historian indeed. Well, with me in the studio is, of course, David Curtin and the journalist and broadcaster Benjamin Butterworth. Benjamin, I'll turn to you first. We covered quite a lot there with Rafe. Rafe is clearly deeply concerned about what these protests have highlighted in terms of how fragile sometimes our society is. Do you share those concerns?
No, not in the way that he does. I think, you know, there's a special place in hell reserved for people that benefit from immigration, for example, as I know he's talked about his parents being immigrants on this channel before, and then tried to pull the ladder up for other people. I think that's deeply selfish. And I was surprised
You just said there's a space in hell for Rafe Heidelman-Koo.
For people that benefit from others, like whether you're gay or a woman or an immigrant, when people that improve those issues and then they want to pull the ladder up, I think that's a deeply selfish way to behave. And I was quite surprised to see him bring a question like that into the marches of people supporting Gaza or Palestine or the Palestinian people, because I don't think that what they represent is in any way hating Britain or the West. Now, look, I'm more inclined to Israel's sympathies than Palestine's on this issue, but many of those people are out there of genuine concern of a political view which is perfectly legitimate, which is shared by lots of people around the world. And the idea that it is some cultural threat to us that they feel this way and that they're going out to protest, I think quite the opposite. Their right to protest and to be disruptive is a British value.
Not even when you see flags of Islamist groups on central London, or when you see chants of Jew hatred.
But those are crimes, and they should be crimes. But I think the idea that that is most of the people on the marches of the scale of the one that we saw yesterday is just unreasonable. You know, there are very few Jews there, but there are also Jewish people. There are lots of white British people, as well as people from the parts where their families come from, the parts of the world like Palestine. And so the idea that it's some kind of representation of multiculturalism failing, I think is quite wrong.
Well, I hope you're right, Benjamin. David?
It's a very strange thing, because we have all of these conflicts around the world. This isn't the only one. I mean, there's conflicts in Kashmir, there's a conflict in Kurdistan, and we have people in this country going out on marches regularly to support either side in many, many of these different conflicts around the world. This wouldn't be happening if we hadn't had mass rapid immigration over the last 30 or 40 years. So there is a factor that this is causing this to happen, which wouldn't happen otherwise. But, you know, I do agree, obviously, when people are here, they have the free speech to protest peacefully about whatever they want. But what disturbs me is the criminal damage going on, the vandalism, the disrespect of people climbing on top of statues of former prime ministers and on the cenotaph and waving flares and actually defacing the plinths that they're on. I think that is absolutely disgusting. And the police are just standing around watching this happen. Maybe they're taking videos of them so they can arrest them later. But I think really something needs to be done to stop this display of disrespect happening within the wider peaceful protest.
Yes, I walked through Parliament Square yesterday on the way back from another event, and I did see a couple of protesters clambering on top of traffic lights, and using these coloured flares like this, and the police didn't take any action. Why do you suppose that is?
Well, look, the first thing I'd say is that clearly that's idiotic and probably illegal. But you do see that happen at protests of almost every description, right? That you get people taking it too far, not knowing how to behave. I know that the police, I think the Met Police, have said that the reason they haven't been arresting, there were only 9 arrests in the protest yesterday. Now, clearly, I highly doubt there were only 9 examples of illegal activity there. But the reason is because they say it's dangerous to go in and arrest someone that's maybe doing a terrorist sympathising chant because of the sheer scale of people there that might be on their side and not the police's side. So they say they're collecting intelligence to review it later. Now,
is that a cop-out?
Good pun. I'd question how successful that will be, given that what we saw a couple of weeks ago was 2 women with paragliding cartoons on their back, which you assume was related to the paragliding terrorists that started this, and they had to put out a public appeal to try and work out who they are. The fact that they didn't think to arrest them, that they struggled to find them, makes me unconvinced they'll do it with hundreds or thousands of others.
Not hopeful, but we'll come back to this. You're watching and listening to GB News Sunday with me, Emily Carver. We've got plenty more coming up on the show today. We'll discuss Keir Starmer's conundrum over his stance on Israel. Labour mutiny, some are calling it. But first, here's the news.
Good afternoon, 1:33. This is the latest from the GB Newsroom. Some communications have been restored in Gaza after a blackout severely impacted yesterday's rescue efforts. Israeli forces are expanding ground operations in Gaza, but the United Nations warns that civil order is starting to fade, with reports of people breaking into aid centres and warehouses in a desperate search for vital supplies. Despite assurances that aid trucks will be allowed in, the UN says supplies are insufficient. Last night, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said the second stage of war with Hamas has begun and warned of a long and difficult campaign ahead. The Gaza Health Ministry said this morning just over 8,000 people have been killed. So Keir Starmer is unlikely to sack anyone for disagreeing with Labour's position on Israel. That's according to the Shadow Science Secretary. Peter Carr says the party's leadership will continue engaging with senior figures despite disagreements with the party's official stance. So Keir has echoed the UN's call for a humanitarian pause in fighting and for aid to be allowed into Gaza. But many in the party want him to go further and back a ceasefire. The Hollywood actor Matthew Perry, star of the legendary sitcom Friends, has died at the age of 54. He became a household name as the dry and witty Chandler Bing, alongside Jennifer Aniston, Lisa Kudrow and others. The enormous success of Friends made it an icon of 90s popular culture. It ran for 10 seasons and the final episode was the 5th most watched finale in TV history. Warner Brothers said in a statement that his comedic genius was felt around the world and his legacy will live on in the hearts of many. For more on all of those stories, you can visit our website, gbnews.com.
Now, something different for you. Former Conservative Minister and Party Chairman Jake Berry sits down with Gloria De Piero for an extremely moving interview. He shares for the first time how his son Milo, 6, is living with autism. You're watching and listening to GB News.
Jake Berry, Conservative MP since 2010, former Cabinet Minister. I guess the objective of these interviews is that people in politics have exactly the same challenges as many other people in the country. So I want to talk to you about something we talked about privately, but you're now willing to talk about with me to raise awareness. I want to ask you about your son, Milo. Tell me about his condition.
Gloria, thanks for having me on, but you know we've talked about this, and I've always been quite reticent, and I think people should be in public life actually to talk about their family. But it really, following the COVID lockdowns, we've seen such an explosion of children with special educational needs, and it's such a battle for parents. I feel compelled to speak out about it because, as you know, having done my job yourself, MPs are there to help people. And it feels like even with all of that benefit that you've got of being an MP, as a parent, it just feels like this isn't an issue that's being talked about and there isn't the right support out there. So my son Milo is 6. He's diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. He doesn't talk, he's non-verbal. And I just, I know as a parent how difficult that is. And so all your viewers who may have children or grandchildren or people they know who are sort of going through particularly the early stages of getting that diagnosis, I think it's really important that we talk about it.
He doesn't talk?
No, I mean, he will say the odd word, but and it's really hard if you've got a child you can't communicate with. But he's an amazing little boy. He is an amazing little boy, and I've got 3 children. I love all of them, but he is something really special. But what I really wanted to come on and say is that so you start to notice that your child isn't developing the way it should, and everyone's so kind. So they're around you and they say, no, of course children all speak at different ages. Of course they walk, talk, get weaned, and they all do. But everyone just tells you it's okay. But as a parent, you come to the point you go, I know it's not. And you then start on this journey of what's wrong with my child. And when you get that diagnosis, the first thing is it's almost like a relief, because you say, oh, I'm not going crazy. There is an explanation about why my child isn't developing the same as other people's children. But then from there, and I know your viewers, I want to say this because I know your viewers will be going through it now. It's like a grieving process for the child that you thought that you were going to have, which may not be there anymore. And I don't blame anyone else for feeling like that, because that's exactly how I felt. And then you sort of hit the internet. And then as a parent, you think, well, what's going to happen to him when I'm not here? Or have I put a huge burden on my other 2 children that they'll have to carry, completely unintentionally, for the rest of their life? And that's why that there's a brief feeling of relief. I know what's wrong. But then I think as a parent, you go into this spiral of, grief, I think, and despair. And why I wanted to come on today is because we've been through that, my wife and I, and we've come out the other side of it. And I want to talk mainly today about the hope that is on the other side. But it's a very, very difficult time for people.
Tell me about the hope. Tell me what you have learned and what might be useful for anybody, the parents that are in a similar situation to you, to learn from your experience.
Well, so when we first got the diagnosis that we've got busy...
When was that?
So late 2019, early 2020. So Milo would have been 3.5, 4. It's quite early. But when we first got that diagnosis, people have really busy lives. So, my wife was just about to have another baby. I was a minister in Boris Johnson's government. I was Northern Powerhouse Minister. And my wife, the first thing, sort of very shortly after that, I resigned from government, not just solely linked to this, but also linked to the fact that my wife had quite bad postnatal depression. But I sort of made a decision, which I hope many of you, the parents watching, would also make, is that you cannot know where your child will end up when they're 18. You can't know when they're 4 or 5 years old. But what I do know for certain is I can't get in a time machine when they are 18 and go back to when they're 4 and do it all over again. So the reason I've resigned from government is because I personally decided, like every other parent would, I'm going to do everything I can to try and change, what could be the trajectory for my child. That was just as lockdown came in, the first lockdown. And my wife reacted in a slightly different way. Her sort of approach was she sort of almost wanted to hide from the world, which I don't blame her for. And she just had a baby, and we ended up over in a home that my family owns. We own over in Wales, and then at the same time, just after lockdown came in, my wife was admitted to hospital as well with some post-birth complication, but she was in for 7 weeks. So that for me was the darkest hour, because I was there. I had 3 infant children. I was driving to hospital every day because my wife was expressing milk in hospital for our 2-week-old daughter. And that was the sort of period of, see, that everyone had a difficult time during lockdown. That was really, really difficult. And sort of almost by accident, I ended up not being at home, and we're being away with her for lockdown. We got massively criticised. Being in the media, we got massively criticised for it. And I think, you know, I just challenge anyone, what would you do if your wife was 150 miles away and she was going to be admitted to hospital and you had 3 infant children, including a 2-week-old baby? And that's, you know, I just wanted to set the record straight about that, because I think one of the real, and I spoke earlier about the danger of talking about family life and politics, one of the real things that I think is the biggest burden on a family, and you'll know this yourself, having been in the front line, is I get paid to take the flak, if you like, and my family don't. And that's why I've thought so much about doing this interview, because now, as we're coming towards an election, that having spent 8 weeks 3 years ago over in Wales during lockdown is being weaponised by my political opponents against, you know, my wife, my family, really against, you know, the situation we found ourselves in. And that's another reason to talk out about this, because, you know, I think that is not the way to behave.
Has it made you wonder whether you want to stay in politics?
No, because no, I don't think politics is about that. I don't think politics is about the smear. You and I found each other on the different side of the house. There's lots we disagreed about, but we do it because we want to make people's lives better. And that's what I did. But on that point of making people's lives better, that's why today I'm calling for all of my colleagues in the House of Commons to start doing much more to support families with children with special educational needs. And it's because once your child is diagnosed, you have that feeling of grief. It was combined with all sorts of other things that were happening in my life, including my mother dying during the second lockdown. So no matter how bad it is, when you've got that darkest hour, it gets better. And for us, it started getting better when we got one of these educational health plans for my son Milo, EHCP as it's known. And then the state kind of kicks in to support you, and that makes a huge difference. But that is probably, going through that process is the hardest thing I've ever done. I trained as a lawyer in the City of London. My wife's a graduate. We did it together. So not only was it almost impossible just to fill the form in because it was so complicated, but it was soul destroying, because you'd get it back and the things it would say about your child, either you couldn't or didn't want to recognise. So, for example, it would say, for Milo, he is a 4-year-old, 5-year-old child. He has the cognitive ability, the ability to speak and process information of a 6-month-old baby. He's a lot better now, but, you know, that, as a parent, it just rips your insides out. And that's why, as a Member of Parliament in Rossendale and Darwen, I started now with doing these support fairs for parents who are going through that process, because everyone in politics, whether it's a councillor, a Member of Parliament, or a lot of the brilliant charities that work in this area, they do it because they want to help people. And there's huge help out there. So my message would be, when you're in that darkest hour, you're not alone. Phone your MP, because they want to help you, no matter what party they're from, they want to help you, and you can get great support on that journey.
How has going through this process changed you, if it has changed you?
Well, do you know what? It's made me a better human being. And the reason it's made me a better human being is because Milo doesn't talk. You don't know if he's looking forward to anything. So I can say, oh, we're going to the park tomorrow. And I don't know if he knows. But then when you get there, more so than any of my other 2 kids, the joy he takes in the moment of being there is extraordinary. And what he has taught me, and we all do this in life, is we're always, what's next? What do we want to do next? What are we planning? Where are we going on holiday? Whatever it is. The biggest lesson he has taught me, and why he's such a blessing, is to take joy in every moment in the way he does. And I think I'm so grateful to have him as my son and those lessons that he's taught me.
Jake Berry, by speaking openly, and I can tell it's been an emotional experience for you, and me too, but you'll help other parents in the same situation as you. And that ending about living in the moment and Milo teaching you how to live in that moment is an incredibly powerful way to end that interview. Thank you.
That was Gloria De Piero interviewing Jake Berry, a very emotional interview. If you want to watch more from Gloria, lots of interviews are available on our YouTube channel. You're watching and listening to GB News. We're going to discuss Keir Starmer's conundrum over his stance on Israel in just one moment. This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. Join me, Mark Dolan, Fridays and Saturdays from 9, Sundays from 10. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
There's only 3 people you can trust in life. Your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Aquare, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle.
Could you be quiet? What is this?
It's
my new teeth. It's your new teeth.
I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There'll be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's, at Drive Time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app, and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Welcome back. Now, the Israel-Hamas war is slowly but surely becoming a little bit of a headache for Sir Keir Starmer. Numerous prominent MPs, elected mayors and hundreds of councillors have piled on the pressure on the Labour leadership to back calls for a ceasefire. So far, he has not said that he does so. Sadiq Khan, Andy Burnham and Anna Sarwar have all advocated for Starmer to change his pro-Israel stance towards backing a ceasefire. Now, the far-left Corbynite Labour MP for Middlesbrough, Andy MacDonald, delivered a speech at the rally yesterday in which he made clear his position.
Let there be no mistake about it. Israel is committing war crimes against Palestinians on an unprecedented scale. And it pains my heart that 75 years on from the Nakba, we're seeing another Nakba play out before us. It is time for political leaders everywhere to call out these crimes against humanity and insist that international law be upheld and demand an immediate, comprehensively binding ceasefire.
Well, there we go. That was one Labour MP of the Corbynite variety at the rally yesterday, making his position very clear indeed on what's going on in Israel and Gaza. So I want to discuss this with my panel. I'm bringing back Benjamin Butterworth and David Curtin to discuss this. Now, Benjamin, how big is this challenge to Keir Starmer's authority?
I think it's probably the biggest that he's faced this side of COVID because it's not as straightforward as left and right within the Labour Party. That's been quite straightforward because there was a lot of Labour MPs that are desperate to win an election and willing to compromise.
Yeah.
But on this, it's much more difficult because there's a significant proportion of the vote in some of these MP seats that are Muslim votes or people from the Muslim world. And so he has this problem because on the one hand, it's been absolutely essential to his leadership to get past the anti-Semitism and the discomfort and anger that the Jewish community felt with the Labour Party. And he's gone out of his way to try and remedy that problem. And I think he's clearly made a lot of progress. But now he's got this issue that by continuing along that path on the Israel stance, and clearly most Jewish people feel very strongly that there shouldn't be a ceasefire, that Israel should defend itself, he's now landed himself in a problem with a much bigger constituency of voters for the Labour Party. And I think that's why he is currently not answering the question. When he's asked about Andy MacDonald's speech there, the Labour Party says, we've got nothing further to add. So they're clearly having a nightmare.
Yes, and Keir Starmer has been on the media rounds on several outlets where he appears to be changing what he originally said about Israel having the right to implement a siege on Gaza. But let's have a look at what's happened since this all kicked off. So a dozen frontbenchers have now defied his position on the Israel-Gaza war. They're demanding an immediate ceasefire. 250 councillors have written a public letter to him. Dozens of councillors have issued similar ceasefire calls. 20 have resigned in protest. They've lost control of Oxford Council now. Pressure is mounting.
Yeah, and he's in big trouble, and this is something that he probably never anticipated would happen because nobody expected this to happen with Israel and Palestine. But yeah, I would imagine that there is a very, very big proportion of the members in the Labour Party who are Muslim. I don't know exactly, but maybe a quarter to a third. But in some of these areas in northern cities where there's been a lot of immigration of Muslim communities in there, like Blackburn, Oldham, Rochdale, etc., and even in some places in London, like Tower Hamlets, he's losing councillors. He's in big trouble.
Benjamin, should we be concerned that we talked about Muslim voters as if they're a homogenous group, but should we be concerned that Muslim voters may well decide a politician's view on this?
But I think you get lots of groups of voters where there's an overwhelming view, right? You know, pensioners take very similar views on economic issues, on immigration issues, on pensions, right? So it's not so unusual. The problem is that this one is heavily concentrated in Labour's vote. Now, the only thing I'd say is that while it's a nightmare, I don't think it's going to have a massive impact on the general election. You look back to 2005, you know, many Muslims in this country were furious at the Iraq war under a Labour government. with few exceptions, they still voted Labour. There isn't a real alternative. George Galloway is probably the nearest that's going to whip up this, and he's not getting anywhere at the moment.
Well, we heard from Benjamin Netanyahu that this is not going to be a short-lived war, although we hope it will be. But that's all we've got for this hour. But don't worry, we've got plenty more to bring you in just a moment. I'm Emily Carver. You're watching and listening to GB News, Britain's news channel. Stay with us.
Who is it? We're here for the show.
More energy this time!
Welcome to the dinosaur hour. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie. Second best. You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Oh! No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays at 9 on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's, at Drive Time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train. Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, welcome to GB News Sunday. Thank you for joining us this lunchtime. I'm Emily Carver. For the next hour, I'll be keeping you company on your TV, online and digital radio. So coming up, as the communications blackout eases in Gaza, Israel's bombardment continues, striking hundreds more Hamas targets. At home and abroad, calls continue to ramp up for an immediate ceasefire. What could that look like? We'll be heading to Israel for the latest. Iranian agents are said to be hijacking pro-Palestinian protests here in the UK. That's according to police and counter-terrorism officers who are warning of increased hostile state activity in Britain directly linked to the Iranian regime. We'll speak to an expert later in the show. And the Prime Minister is set to double down on his approach to net zero in his King's Speech next week, where he will reportedly announce greater North Sea oil and gas exploration, as well as pro-car policies. Is this the right approach as we head towards the general election year? Please do get in touch. Send me your thoughts. gbviews@gbnews.com or send me a message on our socials. We're at GB News. But first, let's get the news headlines with Tatiana.
Emily, thank you. 2:01. This is the latest. Some communications have been restored in Gaza after a blackout severely impacted yesterday's rescue efforts. Israeli forces are expanding ground operations in Gaza, but the United Nations warns that civil order's starting to fade, with reports of people breaking into aid centres and warehouses in a desperate search for vital supplies. Despite assurances that aid trucks will be allowed in, the UN says supplies are insufficient. Last night, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said the second stage of war with Hamas has begun. He warned of a long and difficult campaign ahead. The Gaza Health Ministry said this morning just over 8,000 people have been killed. It's unlikely any Labour MPs will be sacked due to disagreements with the party's position on Israel. That's according to the Shadow Science Secretary. Peter Carl says the party's leadership will probably continue engaging with frontbenchers despite disagreements with Sir Keir Starmer. He's echoed the UN's call for humanitarian pause in fighting and for aid to be allowed into Gaza. But many senior figures want him to go further and back a ceasefire. The Hollywood actor Matthew Perry, star of the legendary sitcom Friends, has died at the age of 54.
Forget hypnosis. The way to quit smoking is you have to dance naked in a field of heather and then bathe in the sweat of 6 healthy young men.
Or what my father calls Thursday night.
Police were called to his home in Los Angeles, where his body was found unresponsive in a hot tub. He became a household name as the dry and witty Chandler Bing, alongside Jennifer Aniston and Lisa Kudrow and others. The enormous success of Friends made it an icon of 90s popular culture. It ran for 10 seasons, and the final episode was the 5th most watched finale in TV history. Warner Brothers said in a statement, his comedic genius was felt around the world and his legacy will live on in the hearts of many. Police are being encouraged to double their use of facial recognition software over the next 6 months to track down known offenders. Policing Minister Chris Philp says the technology could be used to scan more than 200,000 images, matching them against the police database. He's also encouraging officers to expand the use of live facial recognition so offenders might be identified on the spot. Mr Philp says it'll allow police to stay one step ahead of criminals and make Britain streets safer. Meanwhile, the number of police who've been sacked for misconduct is up by 70%, with about 100 losing their jobs in the last 12 months. Metropolitan Police Commissioner Sir Mark Rowley says the number's likely to increase as the force cracks down on those who are unfit to serve. Now, a US tech entrepreneur says the NHS's backlog cannot be resolved without technological innovation. Alex Karps, the chief executive and co-founder of Plantir, which is bidding to win a contract to provide AI software to the health service. He says the use of AI in healthcare would speed up systems and improve life expectancy. It comes as the NHS waiting lists are predicted to top 8 million by next summer. And finally, Scotland's refugees minister is asking the UK government for urgent funding to help communities house migrants. Emma Roddick supports the government's plan to cut the use of hotels for asylum seekers and says tackling a backlog in cases should be a priority. But she warns that shifting the financial burden onto local authorities would be unacceptable and reckless. Immigration Minister Robert Jenrick said this week that the number of hotels used to house migrants will be cut by 50 over the next 3 months. This is GB News across the UK on TV, in your car on digital radio and on your smart speaker by saying play GB News. Now it's back to Emily.
Thanks, Tatiana. So the Israeli military have said that their forces are expanding ground operations in Gaza while their fighter jets have struck hundreds more Hamas targets. Telephone and internet communications have been partially restored in Gaza today. That's after more than a day-long blackout that had badly impacted rescue operations as Israel continued to pound targets of the militant Hamas group. However, thousands in Gaza have broken into aid depots in a worrying sign of civil order starting to break down. That's according to a UN relief agency. And mass calls for a ceasefire grow, including from Pope Francis, who also appealed to Hamas for a release of hostages. So we can now cross over to Tel Aviv to get an update from our Home and Security editor, Mark White, who is there live in Tel Aviv. Mark, thank you very much. The Defence Minister said yesterday for Israel, said, we've moved into a new phase of the war. The ground in Gaza shook tonight.
Yes, so this is the ground war really, but not as we had anticipated that it would be, with potentially tens of thousands of troops and tanks spilling over that border. We're in the second phase and we are seeing significant incursions into northern Gaza, with troops advancing some 4 miles into parts of northern Gaza. They're still there and they're exchanging small arms fire, mortar fire between positions. We know, according to the IDF, that an IDF officer sustained severe injuries yesterday and they were transferred by helicopter out to hospital. Another IDF soldier also injured. So that is continuing. And all the while, of course, we're getting the aerial bombardment very significant in its expansion, with some 450 combat jet strikes on Hamas targets in Gaza over the last 24 hours.
The ceasefire are strengthening in volume from around the world, of course, Arab nations, but in the West too. Has Israel said anything to that point? Presumably it's an impossibility in their view.
Well, Israel said the only people to benefit from a ceasefire would be Hamas, because they would just continue their attempts to attack Israel. It would just allow them to dig in, to consolidate their positions, to regroup and to continue to strike. I say regroup and continue to strike. They're already doing that every day. Just as you were crossing to me there, we got another alert of rocket fire into areas just around the Gaza Strip. They very regularly are firing these rockets across into communities around the Gaza Strip, but probably more aimed at the IDF forces around the Gaza Strip as well. They still have significant capability there. And Israel says its stated goal is to degrade and to eventually destroy Hamas. And to stop now would deny them the opportunity to do that. This terrorist group would simply regroup and then would be as big a threat as ever. It is more than alive to the images that are going out around the world of the toll on the civilian population. But again, it says this has been brought about by the cynical use of civilians as human shields by Hamas, putting their rocket launchers and other terrorist infrastructure in and around sensitive civilian sites like hospitals and mosques and schools, and just in people's apartment blocks. And Israel, in going after them, they say that they do their utmost to alert the civilian population. They carry out a procedure where they effectively knock on the door, as they describe it. They put these percussion charges down that detonate a loud bang, and that tells people that they've got minutes to evacuate a building, and then the strikes come in. That's what they've done over a number of years now to try to limit the number of civilian casualties. But given the intensity of the strikes here, it's very difficult to see how anything is going to happen except yet more in the way of civilian deaths and injuries.
And Mark, just very quickly while I've got you, how concerned should we be that this conflict may fuel radicalisation in this country and heighten the threat of terrorism?
I think very concerned. There is no doubt that the police and intelligence services in the UK are alive again to that threat coming from those that might wish to cause people harm. It doesn't take more than the tiniest percentage of those who are Hamas supporters to be enraged enough to then go and carry out an attack for there to be significant issues. As we speak, the intelligence services and the police are monitoring those extremists that they know, but we also know that there are people who have been radicalized by ISIS and Al-Qaeda over the years, and that happened very quickly, usually over the internet. So with all these images coming out of the Gaza Strip and even the West Bank, that is enough in itself. The police know and the security services know to potentially radicalize people to the point very quickly that they want to go and enact that rage of theirs in a very destructive manner.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Our security editor, Mark White, there, live from Tel Aviv, bringing us the very latest. So joining me for the next hour in the studio is the leader of the Heritage Party, David Curtin, and, of course, Benjamin Butterworth. I'd like to get your views, really, on what Mark White had to say there. We first talked about, well, the current assault from the Israeli Defence Forces onto Gaza, also the humanitarian crisis that is unfolding on the Gaza Strip, calls for a ceasefire, and whether that's actually possible or desirable, and then also the threat of homegrown terrorism here as a result of this conflict. Benjamin, I won't let you take your pick of all that, but what were your reaction to what Mark White was saying there with regard to the terror threat?
In this country?
Yes.
I think, you know, we have seen this before because the Afghanistan and Iraq invasions clearly had consequences for homegrown terrorism. But I often don't like that being a reason to make our policy decisions, because it feels like that allows terrorists and terrorist sympathisers to dictate our foreign policy and how we should behave. And I think if anything is a lesson of what's been going on in Israel and Palestine and Gaza, it's that if you sympathise, if you try and meet in the middle with terrorists, then they will take advantage. And I don't think that should be our foreign policy or Israel's.
Yes, David, our security services must be working overtime.
Yeah, I think the threat of a new terror attack is very real because of what's happened here. People's emotions are heightened at the moment on both sides. There are people suffering on both sides of this, but there's a very, very big pro-Palestinian caucus in this country. You see them out on the streets, most of them being peaceful, but then some of them, are shouting things which could be construed to be inciting violence, inciting crime and glorifying terrorism. So the next step from that is for people to actually then go and actually do a terrorist attack themselves in this country. So the security services must be working overtime. That is a big worry. But, this is one of the reasons why I've called for a ceasefire personally, because I don't want to see any more suffering, any more slaughter on either side over there in the Middle East.
But is that call for a ceasefire from David, is that naive, Benjamin?
I think it is, because what would a ceasefire look like? I mean, Mark White actually explained it in your interview that do you think that if you stopped the war on Gaza, in Gaza, that Hamas would go, yes, OK, we're so sorry, it was a terrible mistake? Of course they wouldn't. Their entire existence, their explicit reason for being in creation is to destroy Israel and the Jewish people. And all they would do is use that as time to regroup and attack. And I think that it's easy for people sat in the comfort of Britain to say, well, war is profoundly ugly and look at these atrocities that are going on. Why don't you just stop it? Well, for the reality of people in Israel, which includes Jews and Arabs and Muslims and Christians on the receiving end of what happened on the 7th of October, they will still be under that severe danger. You have to remove Hamas, and that means it's going to be pretty ugly. And we know, because we learned it in recent days, that Hamas has put one of its bases under the main hospital in Gaza. I think that shows who is the seriously bad actor. And in my opinion, although they're far from perfect, it's not Israel.
And there are a huge number of people in this country and across the West who don't believe anything that the Israeli government put out. They don't believe that the massacre even happened. I've seen people saying this online, and it's deeply concerning because there is so much propaganda going about, and it is hard for people to know what is and isn't true. And of course, if you have an ideological background to this, then you're going to pick and choose what you believe, and it could be dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's propaganda on both sides. And we have to realise this is what happens in a war. The fog of war is there, and it's very, very hard to work out exactly the truth of what is going on. But yeah, people are emotionally connected to one side or the other in very many cases. I'm not pro one side or pro the other. I'm just pro peace, and I see this as a conflict which has been going on for decades, and I wish it would come to an end.
And Benjamin, I know you've spoken about this before, but Jewish people are feeling unsafe at the moment in this country, and Britain provided a sanctuary for Jewish people, and now Jewish people are feeling unsafe, unwanted even, and fearful of the future. That is damning.
I mean, we've seen, I think the figure is a 1,200% rise in anti-Semitic hate crimes being recorded if you compare it with the October of last year. And I think, you know, we started this discussion by talking about homegrown terrorism. I think one of the dangers when you see protest marches like yesterday and chants of jihad and from the river to the sea, which means the eradication of Israel, that there is almost a normalisation of that kind of extreme rhetoric, that extreme view that many would consider anti-Semitic, I would, and that becomes normalised by these protests and far more people take it for granted. And London has a big Jewish population. Half of all the Jews in Britain live in the capital city. And so when they see instances like that, I know from Jewish friends that they're scared to go out. I interviewed Josh Howie, who's a presenter, a comedian on Headliners here, a Jewish man, and he has 5 kids. And he told me a couple of weeks ago when this started, he's had to explain to his kids why they shouldn't wear their kippah, their hat, or why they shouldn't wear their school uniform with a Hebrew writing on it to go to school, because he said to his kids, there are people that hate you because of who you are as a Jew. Now, the idea that you've got people feeling like that in modern Britain should shame us all.
Yes, and we've fought these battles before. It's deeply, deeply sad to see, David, isn't it, that Jewish people are feeling under attack in Britain due to this conflict, Israel, Gaza. What question to put to you? How do we show Jewish people that they are welcome in this country?
Of course. I mean, it's absolutely horrendous, isn't it? That anyone, any group cannot just be who they are. You know, the Jewish people who've lived in areas and communities for decades and centuries now feel unsafe in their own communities. This is absolutely horrible. You know, I just wish that this wasn't coming out and being played out on the streets of this country. You know, but how we deal with this is a difficult question.
We've seen people propagating conspiracy theories and anti-Semitic tropes that would be welcomed in Nazi Germany, to be honest, and it is pretty horrifying and disgusting. I know that the vast majority of people in this country absolutely detest anti-Semitism. We'll talk about the Iranian influence on protests in just one moment. You're watching and listening to GB News Sunday with me, Emily Carver. We've got lots more coming up. Also, economic misery could be on the way. Is the UK economy the tipping point of the Western world when it comes to debt? We'll be debating that and much more. All of that to come. You're watching and listening to GB News, Britain's news channel.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. Join me, Mark Dolan, Fridays and Saturdays from 9, Sundays from 10. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
There's only 3 people you can trust in life. Your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana. I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Akweer, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle.
Could you be quiet? What is this? It's my new teeth. It's your new teeth.
I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes & Co, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate. Both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christys, at Drive Time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app, and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christys, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Welcome back to GB News Sunday with me, Emily Carver. I'm on your TV, online and digital radio. We're moving away from the Israel-Hamas conflict because this week we've had some fresh warnings when it comes to the state of the global economy. Yes, the HSBC boss warned that the world is at a tipping point when it comes to the level of debt economies around the world have accrued. And the warning comes as global GDP growth has slowed, the Middle East is in turmoil and the price of oil is on the rise. Is Britain dangerously exposed due to years of government borrowing binges and our reliance on importing energy? So joining me now is Vicky Price, Chief Economic Advisor for the Centre for Economic and Business Research. Vicky, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. Do you share the concerns that the HSBC boss has said there?
Well, absolutely. What we're seeing is that there is a slowdown in the world economy. There are some exceptions. You've got the US, of course, doing quite well, and we had some real strong figures for the last quarter coming out just in a few days ago. And you've also got China, which has not been doing that well recently, but where we're seeing a little bit of a rejuvenation with the government there starting to do a bit more in terms of trying to stimulate the economy after the problems it has had for some time. They still have issues of property sector in particular, but they're beginning to cut interest rates in order to get the economy moving. But overall, those two countries are in the positive territory, if you like. So they're growing reasonably fast, even though perhaps in China not as fast as they had hoped. What you're seeing, though, is that there is a serious issue with Europe. And Europe is lagging behind without any doubt. And one of the reasons, of course, is that it has been so dependent on Russian gas. It has to cut back quite significantly on that dependence. Energy-intensive sectors have had to reduce their energy consumption. And places like Germany are in recession territory really right now, and that affects the economy across the region, and that's the real problem. So if you put that in the mix, then you've got a real issue as to what the economy may be doing in the next year.
And Vicky, do you also share the assessment or agree with the assessment that our government and other Western governments have been irresponsibly borrowing money for far too long and the chickens are coming home to roost?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, the reality is, of course, that the borrowing that has taken place started being sort of quite significant in the aftermath of the financial crisis. And of course, it had to be done in order to stabilize the economies and to help the banking sector. But at that time, interest rates were very low, so it hardly mattered that you borrowed a lot. Now, of course, we added to that borrowing through COVID. Where we needed to stimulate the economy and make sure that it didn't collapse and that employment was kept at a reasonable level and people still had some money in their pockets. So that added hugely to that debt. But what you're seeing is that although it's a bit of a problem for countries, for example, like Italy and possibly Greece, and of course, Germany has always been very careful how much it borrows, the reality is that if you compare how much countries have borrowed across, there are some that are doing really well, which have borrowed an awful lot of extra money. And one of them is the US, that we were just talking about, where its debt to GDP ratio is over 120%. So that's a lot higher than is the case here. So yes, of course, there is a lot of debt, public sector debt, but also private sector debt. And that is beginning to be an issue because, of course, interest rates have gone up and servicing that debt has become so much more expensive.
And Vicky, there's absolutely zero appetite, isn't there, in the UK for cuts to public spending. The Treasury has so many demands on it, and those seem to only be growing. Do you expect any government going forward, will they have to rein in that spending?
I think a little bit, yes. But of course, we've seen the HS2 decision, which was a cut in spending. I mean, whether that 36 billion is going to be spent in the short term is questionable on infrastructure. It may be spent on other things. Maybe it will allow some small changes in the tax rates. I mean, who knows? Inheritance tax has been mentioned, of course, but it doesn't raise that much. So perhaps it wouldn't matter hugely, except in terms of the optics. But you're right on the overall spending side. I mean, what we saw after the financial crisis was a real austerity, period during which almost all departments had cutbacks, except in the NHS, which saw a bit of an increase, but it wasn't really big enough anyway to sustain what came later, which is a response to COVID. But what the government has said so far, I mean, it's efficiencies. Efficiencies mean cuts, I'm afraid. So how various government departments will find that is a big question mark. And the second thing, of course, that they have announced is that they're going to freeze the number of civil servants. They're not going to hire anymore. In fact, reduce them to where they were possibly sort of pre-financial crisis. Well, that, again, isn't going to save huge amounts. So I'm afraid you're right. There are huge demands on public services, a lot of problems with many of them that really they can't perform properly right now. So I think it's unlikely.
Absolutely, and it's our welfare, pensions, the NHS, of course, that eat up so much of the budgets. Thank you very much indeed, Vicky Price, Chief Economic Advisor for the Centre for Economic and Business Research. So let's bring in my panel, Benjamin Butterworth and David Curtin. David, are you alarmed by the level of debt?
I've been alarmed by the level of debt for more than 10 years in this country.
For donkey's years.
Absolutely, yeah. Labour left office in 2010 with about £800 billion of debt. The Tories have tripled that. We now have £2.5 trillion of debt. We're never going to pay that back because, at the moment now we've got interest rates going up. So just servicing the national debt is over £100 billion a year. So you're talking about little cuts here and there. I mean, we need to cut so much. We need to cut £110 billion from the budget. There's a lot you can do every year. There's a lot you could do to achieve that. I mean, we're spending huge amounts on foreign aid, for example, on migrant hotels, on green subsidies for new green technology, on wind and solar, rather than investing in energy, which is going to be cheap and is going to be not need so much of a subsidy, which will keep the economy going. So there's been huge financial irresponsibility over 20 or 30 years, which has got us into this place.
Are we spending money on the wrong things, Benjamin? Is that why we're in this mess?
No, I don't think that's the answer at all. Look, the cost of servicing the debt has gone through the roof because of central bank interest rates.
They could have seen that coming. Surely they didn't believe that interest rates would always be at zero.
But the idea that you could cut back public services and essential services in order to get down that 110 billion, I think is the wrong way of looking at it. The fact is that we have very low growth. It's been low for the best part of a decade. It's been deeply underwhelming. And you have to grow the pie in order to overcome that. David mentioned the last Labour...
I like that. That sounds sort of Liz Truss vibes coming from you, Benjamin. Grow the pie so everyone has a bigger slice.
But I would say it's a Tony Blair vibe, because David mentioned the last Labour government, the debt was much higher in 2010. But until 2007, the debt was lower. In fact, we had a surplus for several years.
No, only one year.
Term.
Only 2001. That was the only year there was a surplus. I think Brown.
What we've had is that we had this idea that austerity and cutting back would fix the problem, and it didn't. We had a decade of stagnant growth. And so I think the investments in things like green technology are essential to our economic future. And the one other point I'd make is that infrastructure spending, like on High Speed 2, should be separated out to day-to-day public service spending, because projects like that, you know, it might have 36 billion to go, but those are essential to creating the means to have a successful economy. There's a reason why lots of countries like South Korea, Japan, China have amazing public services and trains, and that benefits their economy. I think it would be a mistake to cut those.
You can't separate it out from the budget, though, because you've still got to pay for it. It's still got to be paid for, and it's still got to be paid for from the current account. So you need to take all of these things together and reduce the budget in total.
That's like pretending that my spending on my Amex doesn't count because, you know, it's on my Amex.
Well, don't tell me it counts. I'm working on the understanding it doesn't. But look, I think it would be a mistake to think that spending on major infrastructure projects, whether it's buses, trains, high-speed trains, to cut those things. And clearly that's an attitude that Sunak has been looking at, because he's taken all that money out of HS2 and put it into local railway.
I'm surprised, and our viewers will probably be surprised, that you haven't mentioned the pensions. That's usually what you go for when it comes to looking for things to cut.
It's a Sunday. I won't be so provocative.
You're watching and listening to GB News Sunday with me, Emily Carver. Let me know if you're worried about the scale of our debt. Do you have the bandwidth to be worried about it? Lots more coming up on today's show. In just a moment, we'll be discussing the mass pro-Palestine protests that we saw in London and across the UK yesterday. It's been reported that Iran are hijacking them to stir up more problems on our streets. Just how much of a threat are they? We'll get expert opinion on that. But before that, here is the news with Tatiana.
Emily, thank you. This is the latest from the GB newsroom. Some communications have been restored in Gaza after a blackout severely impacted yesterday's rescue efforts. The US says it's being candid with Israel over its war with Hamas as ground operations in Gaza are expanded. But the United Nations warns that civil order is starting to fade, with reports of people breaking into aid centres and warehouses in a desperate search for vital supplies. Despite assurances that aid trucks will be allowed in, the UN says supplies are insufficient. Last night, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said the second stage of war with Hamas has begun and warned of a long and difficult campaign ahead. The Gaza Health Ministry said this morning just over 8,000 people have been killed. Sir Keir Starmer is unlikely to sack anyone for disagreeing with Labour's position on Israel, as according to the Shadow Science Secretary. Peter Carl says the party's leadership will continue engaging with senior figures despite disagreements with the party's official stance. Sir Keir's echoed the UN's call for a humanitarian pause in fighting and for aid to be allowed into Gaza. But many in the party want him to go further and back a ceasefire. And the Hollywood actor Matthew Perry, star of the legendary sitcom Friends, has died at the age of 54. He became a household name as the dry and witty Chandler Bing, alongside Jennifer Aniston, Lisa Kudrow and others. The enormous success of Friends made it an icon of 90s popular culture. It ran for 10 seasons. The final episode was the 5th most watched finale in TV history. Warner Brothers said in a statement, his comedic genius was felt around the world and his legacy will live on in the hearts of many. You can get more on all of those stories by visiting our website, gbnews.com.
Who is it? We're here for the show.
For
Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie.
Second best.
You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Oh! No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays at 9 on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's, at Drive Time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this?
Are you rethinking this policy?
Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Welcome back to GB News Sunday with me, Emily Carver. I'm on your TV, online and digital radio. Now, counter-terrorism officers have held private discussions about Iran trying to stoke protests over Israel's bombing of Gaza and have warned of Iranian influence in the pro-Palestinian activism we're seeing in the UK. It comes as last week, Counter-Extremism Commissioner Robin Simcox warned that the scale of Iranian-backed activity in this country and the extent to which Iran attempts to stoke extremism here was underappreciated. So joining me now is former head of counter-terrorism at the MOD, Major General Chip Chapman. Chip, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. I want to get your insight into this issue, really. We're hearing that police officers and counter-terrorism officers are warning about the influence of Iran on protests here.
Well, the first thing is we've known about the Iranian influence for a number of years. So if you go back, for example, 2 years to Richard Moore, the head of MI6, who talked about an era of contested states, and the top three were Russia, China and Iran, alongside international terrorism, and that Iran has an explicit doctrine of conflict with both Israel and the West. This was then further amplified by the head of MI5, Ken McCullum, who talked about literally the same sort of thing, and that this is increasing in severity and complexity. Further to that, the head of Counter-Terrorist Command in February this year told us about 15 plots to kidnap or kill British or UK-based individuals it considered to be enemies of the Iranian state. It was that led to the Iranian international TV having to move from the UK to the US because of those explicit threats. So we've known about it for a long time in terms of the physical element of it. In terms of the digital element of it and how this sort of plays out, one thing that the Iranians have done, particularly through the IRGC Quds Force, that's the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Force, and Quds here in this context means the Holy or Jerusalem, and of course they want to destroy the Israeli state, is that they seek plausible deniability. So the way they're doing this is by using front groups or proxy groups, hoping to weaken the resolve of the British government or whatever, and to also use agents of influence. That would be groups or subgroups who don't necessarily know that they might have been being played by the Iranians. And we know this in a longer term sense because some of the physical stuff they've done alongside those 15 plots I mentioned was a plot about 12 years ago in Washington to kill the Saudi Arabian ambassador. And for that, they used a naturalized US citizen who also had an Iranian passport. He was indicted along with a Quds Force member who they couldn't get because he was in Iran. Now, there's a large Iranian diaspora in the UK. Most of them absolutely hate the Iranians post the 79 revolution, but I'm sure there are a few of them who've been compromised either because of ideology, money, or ego. And it's that sort of moving people in the digital space as well from their preference bubbles, either for some of the language we see, which a lot of it has little meaning unless you really interrogate it. You know, the decolonization word, ceasefire, without any understanding what that means, and therefore trying to stoke a religious, ethnic, sectarian, tribal, or ideological discord and weaken the UK base. So really what we're really seeing along here is that they're able to do something along with China and Russia that they couldn't do in the analog era, and that is information warfare, where they try and fracture societies from within.
Now, Chip, the influence of Iran, the hostile influence of Iran, has been something that researchers, think tanks, experts have been looking into in this country and the States for many years. But would you agree with Robin Simcox, who says that it's been underappreciated? People haven't quite understood how vast a problem this is.
Well, I think the security agencies have always understood how prevalent it is. I don't think the general population have. But really, we've had a major scale project from the Iranians really since their revolution to confront Israel and the wider Middle East. I mean, effectively, they've created 6 terror armies: Hamas, the Houthis, the Hezbollah, the PMF in Iraq, and the Liwa Fatemayoun, which is an Afghan Shia militia group, and the group called the Liya Zanabayum, another Pakistani group, which they've used in Syria. So there's a lot of external armies they've created. They haven't created those in the UK, but it is this sort of influence operation to really alter the minds of both the enemy nations and the neutrals looking on circle by circle. And that's what these information operations by the Iranians and all hostile states are designed to do.
Well, thank you very much indeed for your expert analysis there. Chip Chapman, former head of counter-terrorism at the MOD. Thank you very much for your time. Now, I want to bring in my panel on this one. Now, I know, Benjamin Butterworth, you have interest in this area and you've written on Iranian assassination attempts in this country.
I spent several months earlier this year looking into this because the head of MI5 talked to those 15 assassination plots, and I managed to track some of those victims down to speak for the first time. And one of them was a woman called Anna Diamond, who'd been a hostage in Iran. She's part Iranian. And when she came back to this country to live in London, she started getting calls from Iranian supporters of the regime, and they were following her around. They threatened to poison her in an NHS hospital, which she regularly went to, and said that nobody would suspect your death. I spoke to another man, a British man living in London, who described that his father, who's a dissident back in Iran, he'd been sent threatening letters to his home address that said, if you don't stop speaking out against the Iranian regime from London, then we will attack your dad. And his father was waterboarded several weeks later. And then after that, in central London, several Iranian agents tried to capture him and bundle him into the back of a van in broad daylight on a shopping high street. Now, the fact that these are happening, that the police were informed of them, and that it isn't a prescribed terrorist organisation, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, despite these assassination attempts, is horrendous. I spoke to one man who's a high-profile Jewish person in this country who spoke to me anonymously, who said that his entire life has been turned upside down. He has to have police security. His home has had to have all new windows and doors. He's had his grandchildren threatened with being abducted on the streets of Britain by supporters of Iran. Now, these are utterly shocking stories. I'd say they are as shocking as what happened with the Salisbury poisoning by Russia a few years ago, and yet they get so little attention.
It's interesting, isn't it? They do. They do. And people have been warning about the influence and the threat of Iran, not least with terror organisations and their backing of them financially. But it doesn't get as much interest as perhaps the threat of Russia does.
Russia and maybe China as well.
Yeah,
we know
China
that
too,
China has a very big intelligence operation in this country. They've got their own sort of police stations that look after and observe and surveil Chinese citizens in this country. I mean, that's known and that's got publicity before. I mean, this is the first time I've heard of Iran having such a big operation in this country. But it isn't surprising because lots of countries around the world that are increasing in power, increasing in influence, will want to influence the citizens of this country, like they would want to influence the citizens in America and other places in the West, because we are an important people, and public opinion here really does matter in terms of shaping global events. So that isn't surprising.
But I think the way Iran does it, lots of countries, I suspect, including Britain, behave in that, in a diplomatic level. But Iran does it in a deeply sinister way. It is trying to murder British citizens on British soil. That is a matter of fact. And the idea that Britain doesn't take that more seriously, that our domestic and foreign policy tries to look the other way in Iran. There's a guy called Vahid Beheshti, who's an Iranian British journalist, who went on hunger strike for more than 70 days to try and raise this issue. And the other week, he waved an Israeli flag on Whitehall, where he continues to camp out, and he was threatened with being beheaded by a man with a knife. Now, the police arrested that person, thank God. But the fact that they are behaving like that on the streets of Britain should terrify us. And lots of the people I spoke to, security experts and victims, said that there's a real network. And so I think the report that you had there about them trying to influence these protests, I've absolutely no doubt it's true.
Yes, and clearly it doesn't scratch the sides of the issue of Iranian influence. Now we're going to move on to our final story of the show. It's being reported that Rishi Sunak will use next week's King's Speech to advance the expansion of North Sea oil and gas exploration, as well as pro-car policies. That's in a continuation of his scrutiny of net zero plans, and to also create a bit of a difference between him and the Labour Party's position. This follows the announcement in September of a major U-turn on green policy. He postponed the deadline for selling new petrol and diesel cars, and also the phasing out of gas boilers. So joining me now is Andrew Montford, the Director of Net Zero Watch. Andrew, thank you very much. Are you convinced that Rishi Sunak is going to pursue, well, less of a net zero drive?
No, not particularly. I think it's more likely that this will be about continuing with the anti-net zero mood music, but not actually delivering anything very much in terms of policy changes. You described what he did last time round as a major U-turn. Well, he delayed a couple of phasings out by 5 years. I mean, it's nothing at all, really. But I think you were quite right when you said this was about trying to create a gap between Conservatives and Labour on this issue, to make it an election issue. And that is important because we've been denied a conversation about the nitty-gritty of net zero and what it means for society for the last, however many years. So I think it is important that it is now out there in front for people to talk about.
Yes, Andrew, I think you're right. Not a major U-turn, really, delaying the phasing out of new petrol and diesel cars and the removal of gas boilers. Just a very, very minor dilution of net zero plans. And, of course, net zero is very much in our law, so they are legally binded to reach it somehow. In terms of gas and oil exploration. It does seem, though, that both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party are realising that we are going to need to continue to explore for gas and oil, aren't we?
Absolutely. The world is increasingly unstable. I mean, you've just had the big stories about Iranian influence and the protests and the problems in the Middle East. In that kind of world, I think getting our own supplies of oil and gas and expanding them is extremely important. I think if they were serious about this issue, truly serious about this issue, they would start looking at onshore gas again, at fracking, because the problem with offshore oil and gas, and indeed offshore wind farms as well, is that they are a security vulnerability. Anybody can disconnect your oil production or your wind farm from the mainland very easily without being detected. So that's a real security risk that I think has to be looked at now.
Very interesting indeed. Thank you for your time, Andrew Mumford, there, Director of Net Zero Watch. Always lovely to speak to you. So let's see what my panel think of this. You know, we've had some agreement today on the show between my panellists, but I think this one may divide. Go on, Benjamin. Is diluting net zero a good thing, a vote winner?
I certainly don't think it's a good thing, because
Vote winner.
I think, well, what happened was you had the Uxbridge by-election, where people didn't want the expansion of this costly low-emission zone to outer London, and that was the only reason the Tories managed to keep that seat. Now, I think the Tories applying that to the rest of the country is a mistake, that idea that it's the way to win votes, because you see overwhelmingly that it's maybe the third or fourth concern that people have in their voting decisions is the environment. And, you know, a lot of people in this country, it's a country full of countryside, are worried about the country we're going to hand to their kids and their grandkids. I think the oil issue probably isn't that big a thing for most people. I think it slightly passes them by. It's not a major interest. But there's sort of the fact that we're a polluted country, the fact that we're damaging the environment, the fact that climate change is so drastic. You know, the most watched BBC show is Planet Earth. The idea that most people don't care about protecting the environment and climate change is for the birds. And I think you saw in those two by-elections, it did nothing for the Tories.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right that people care hugely about their immediate environment and the state of the world. It's whether you believe that the policies the government implements are going to improve the environment, and whether they're sometimes borderline authoritarian.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, everybody cares about the environment. We have a beautiful countryside, and people want to preserve that for our generation and to hand down to generations to come as well. But I think what Rishi Sunak is doing here is just, it's just for the show. It's just for show. There's an election coming up in the next 12 months. So he's saying something that he thinks is going to be popular to his base, because net zero is vastly unpopular among people who are Conservative voters and people who see through the whole climate alarmism, climate emergency hoax, which it is, because carbon dioxide is not a harmful gas. But he's not going nearly far enough. He needs to come out of the Paris Climate Agreement, come out of Agenda 2030, repeal the Climate Change Act and get rid of this...
I'll have to let Benjamin come back on that one.
Well, that's obviously conspiratorial nonsense.
No,
that's not based in science or fact.
It is. I've given you scientific fact.
No, you haven't. You've given spin, hard right spin, that
carbon dioxide.
The vast majority of the British people
certainly don't think that.
It's not hard right spin
to say carbon dioxide is not harmful. That's scientific.
Neither scientists nor the British people agree with that view of climate change, and I think it'd be a very dangerous way to behave. Look, I think
dangerous. Come on, is fact.
Well, I think the many Commonwealth nations that are going underwater would say that climate change is an abundant issue.
What nations have gone underwater? There's not one nation that's gone underwater.
Well, Bangladesh, for example, is having the worst flooding it's ever had. I was in Indonesia.
But that's not due to sea levels rising, that's due to the river overflowing.
You know, Indonesia is having to move its capital city because it's going underwater.
Right, well, as riveting...
No, what's the new capital of Indonesia?
It's moving it to Papa.
To Papa?
Yeah, to the island.
On that note,
Papa Daddy.
As riveting as this conversation is, and please do keep getting in touch with your views at home, we're going to go to some emails because you've been sending them in throughout, and we must do before the end of the show. Mike says, face coverings should now be... I thought we'd gone back to the pandemic. Face coverings should now be banned across the board for protests, just like in France. Yes, I walked through the protests yesterday, and I hate seeing people in balaclavas. It is truly intimidating. Andrew says, we need a leader with business experience. Labour's record of banishing boom and bust, then leaving the Treasury with a note to say the money's run out, tells you everything about their competence. And Belinda says there is no valid reason to pursue net zero. It will ruin our country. Well, keep your views coming in, because that's it from me today. But stay tuned, because Nana is up next, and she has delighted us with her company.
Are you wearing my dress?
I think I might be. I've pinched it.
How dare you?
This one's mine, I promise.
Is it? Well,
I promise.
It's very pretty, very pretty.
It is.
But yeah, we have got, because I know you spoke about Elon Levy, he's coming on to our show.
Oh, fantastic.
At about 4:45. Of course, he was sort of in charge of that press conference where they showed the Hamas body cam of the atrocities that happened on the 7th of October. So we'll be speaking to him directly, live from Israel, also discussing the war. As ever, I've got a great monologue. I say it, if I do say so myself. Now, this one's about the BBC. You know, I love the BBC, but I'm just so disappointed at, you know, the situation that's on with them. Anyway, we'll be talking about that and lots more.
The world loves your monologues, I must say. They are brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. You've been watching and listening to GB News Sunday with me, Emily Carver. Thank you to my wonderful panel, Benjamin Butterworth and David Curtin. And thank you for joining me at home. Don't go anywhere. It is Nana, and she's up next. But first, the weather.
Good afternoon, my name's Rachel Ayres and welcome to your latest GB News weather forecast brought to you by the Met Office. So as we go through the rest of Sunday, plenty of rain still around, and that's all due to this area of low pressure out to the west of the UK. It's this low in the North Sea that's been bringing rain across Scotland and northern parts of England throughout today, and that will continue for a time as we go through this evening, but slowly pulling away to the east as the low moves away. Elsewhere, it'll be a mixture of clear spells and showers around through tonight, but then becoming increasingly confined to southern and western coast to allow for some clear spells in the east and across northern parts of Scotland. So we could see the odd patch of fog tonight and maybe a touch of frost across northwestern parts of Scotland to start Monday. It's another day of sunshine and showers for many as we go through Monday, with showers most frequent once again across southern and western coasts. A bit more in the way of sunshine there across the south of England than we've seen over the weekend, but a persistent band of showers feeding into Northern Ireland throughout the day on Monday.